So welcome to this version of week 4, Christian Interreligious and Intercultural Encounter coursework. And the topic this week, Return to the Body, Dimensions of Encounter. You'll see the course readings, the 2 that are required, and then there are a couple or 3 that are optional, depending on what draws your attention. But the arc of my comments in this presentation have to do with the approach that was shown to me over a course of 15 years that is centered in prayer. It actually opens with the question of love and knowledge. How are they related? I always like to say this, do we love to understand someone, or do we understand someone so to love them? And each has its scriptural streams. Most folks say that love and knowledge are complementary, but I think a concerted examination of how that plays in our own lives, in our own minds, assumptions, preconceived notions, invitations to consider, I think is an important task or opportunity to be about. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time with that love and knowledge question, and then give a little bit of an overview to how this course has been created from encounters over a period of about 15 years. There'll be some stories that perhaps might come in some of that, and why I think this is the most promising approach, given so many of the challenges in our world today. I think some of the previous approaches that I have learned from greatly and I have relied on are insufficient. They're not going to get us where we need to go. So, which for me is kingdom speech. So then I'll get into a little bit of the readings, so you can make some choices about what readings might be beneficial for you. And then I will invite you to also the practice of the week, which is going to be a return to the body, embodied prayer. And so I'll say a little bit more about that in the course. So anyway, that's the arc of the reflections here today. So again, it's spoken in an either or fashion, and of course these things are complementary, but it does give some structure, which I think we live out. Often we think, if I just knew more, if I understood more, I could love someone better. And of course, we know that's true. If you've ever lived in a significant partnership over a period of years, you realize, wow, I never knew that about you. And now knowing what is the act and the invitation to will the good of that beloved, even though, I don't really like that behavior, or however that may play. So once we understand, we can make the choice more specifically to will the good for the other, which is Thomas Aquinas's definition of love. But I think there's also something about, meeting somebody on the street, encountering someone in an unexpected way, and to greet them already loving them means that you are predisposed to learn from them in a particular way. You may still come out on the other side not liking them, not wanting to be around them, but you will come to encounter them, you will come to know them in a way if you greet them in love, if you greet them in the way that, we speak of, being a compassionate presence, or in the pastoral business, a non-anxious pastoral presence in our encounters. When you are grounded in love already, and you see out of the eyes of love, you will see differently than if you are looking with different eyes, maybe from your family of origin, or from your community, from your culture that's had a really historic, difficult relationship with another culture. I mean, all of those pieces come into play if you're looking from the mind and from the memory. But if you're looking from love, you wind up seeing differently. They're complementary, and how do they relate? Of course, there are different, each position has its own scriptural streams. I invite you to Philippians 1, 9 through 11. Says, and this is my prayer, that your love may overflow more and more with knowledge and full insight, to help you determine what is best. It is the love that is to overflow with more knowledge, not the more knowledge that then is to push away. Or 1 Corinthians 8, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Again, returning to love as the willing the good for the other. Romans 13, owe no one anything except to love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. And that gets interesting. So if you love the one whose politics make your blood boil, you are fulfilling the law, based in Romans in that. Now, Ephesians 3, 14 through 19, this is only just some of the words. According to the riches of God's glory, God may grant that you may be strengthened in your inner being with power through the Spirit, and that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, as you are being rooted and grounded in love, the love that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. So love that surpasses knowledge. It doesn't mean that it ignores knowledge. It doesn't deny knowledge. It doesn't refuse knowledge, but something about love surpasses knowledge. Then in our tradition, Augustine of Hippo says, knowledge is only good when accompanied by love. Otherwise, it can lead to pride. Love is the highest form of knowing. I got that from a Center for Action and Contemplation daily meditation from a couple years ago. Wisdom is knowledge deepened by love. The wise person knows more deeply by way of love than by way of argument, because the eye of the heart can see the truth of reality. Hence, the wise person is one who knows and sees God shining through everything, even what seems ugly or despised. So what does it mean to see God in that which you find ugly, that which you find shameful, that which you find despised? How do you learn to look for God in the unexpected places, which could be a subtitle for this entire course? And then Gregory the Great, love itself is a form of knowing. That I got from Sarah Coakley. There's a new book out called Spiritual Life, in which she has an essay, Visions of the Self in Late Medieval Christianity. So, there's streams that invite knowledge, that invite love. Love seems to be prioritized, and yet we live in a culture that seeks to know. You're in a seminary context, which automatically prioritizes seeking to know. So what does it mean to love first? Something for you to think about, pray into, ponder. So there are multiple ways to get into this course as a disciplinary inquiry, and we will touch on those in a couple weeks. I have often taught this course from sort of a disciplinary inquiry or a disciplinary field called theologies of religious pluralism. Took me a little bit to come back with that, which is the sort of the academic way. Most folks that I have worked with in this field are rooted in institutions that are grounded in a particular religious tradition, whether it's Jewish, Islamic, Christian, Buddhist. It tends to be tradition-located, mono-traditional institutional affiliations. So in the Protestant world, we have a lot of diversity about what that could mean, and we get caught up in some of that. But across traditions, it tends to be scholars who were coming from a mono-traditional setting. Sometimes you would get university folks that are coming from, and that's almost a sense of not having a traditional perspective at all, but having a disciplinary perspective rooted in religious studies or in sociology, anthropology, the human sciences, that didn't have either a faith commitment or a traditional affiliation in the sense of a religious affiliation. So we would talk about this in terms of religious pluralism. Comparative theology is a phrase that's often used for this kind of course content. I'm a practical theologian, Christian. I call myself a spirituality scholar now because that's the guild that I work with the most. Really interested in religious leadership, spirituality, formation, as a sort of, so my area was always, where does the rubber hit the road? So that's why there are a lot more practices in this course, because I agree with Cynthia Bourgeault that knowledge is actually state dependent, which is some of where I want to get to. So this approach, I've called it a companionable way, hence the name of the book. And I speak through what I call dimensions of encounter. Sounds highfalutin. It isn't really. It's just, if you have a body, you have access to these dimensions in your world. That's it. I wasn't trying to, go through a philosophical lens or through a disciplinary lens or through a religious lens alone. I wanted to be in the body. And if you have a body, you can access all of these dimensions because your body needs or exists already in all of these dimensions. So the invitation really is knowing of the heart with the eye of love. Comes from a guy, James Altice, who wrote a collection of essays, Loving Otherwise, other/wise. Which was one of the earliest texts that I encountered when I began to create this course. I really appreciated knowing with the heart, with the eye of love. Cynthia Bourgeault is another scholar that you will encounter over the course of the semester. She speaks of it as seeing with the eye of the heart. She has a particular contemplative centering prayer approach that deeply relates Ora and Labora, work and prayer. Again, a body-centric theology, in the sense of practice is important. So I always just put that in the shorthand of seeing with the heart. Some of the contemplatives that I have studied with have talked about the practice of bringing the mind into the heart in prayer. And so that's where that comes from. And, some folks say knowledge is knowledge and it's not state dependent. And of course, that's true. 2 + 2 is 4. There's some things that in the world are just what they are. And texts, particularly ancient texts, our scriptures, for instance, translated over centuries, translated through communities of discourse, translated through communities of faith over hundreds of years. There's a whole different invitation to what I call, well, actually, I didn't call it, I just call it, in this context, I use the phrase dislocated exegesis. There was a scholar down at Duke who was the first one to use the phrase for me. She had written, Lauren Winner is her name. She had written a book called Sabbath, Mudhouse Sabbath, I think was the name of it. She's a spirituality scholar at Duke. And I used her invitation in the pilgrimage. So when you go on the immersion experience, you'll have this invitation to choose a scripture text that you would like to companion you through the course of the immersion. And the invitation is to consider its meaning in each place that you visit, in each day, in each, encounter. And and it's simply an invitation to see where we are, how we are, what we're feeling, what we're looking at can shape how we see something, how we come to know something. Hence dislocated exegesis. It doesn't take away from absolute truth, but it does place us in our bodies in a historical finitude, humus, earth-rooted kind of way, which is also important in considering what's significant in any encounter. So this invitation to a companionable way is to begin in the world. It's not in your head, it's not in tradition, it's not in fear of the future or anticipation of the future. It is to begin in the world, in the present moment, with sacred intention. So seeking God, seeking Spirit's guidance, and humility. Again, not self-neglect or self-denial, but humus, being in the body. Humility with a desire to know, a desire meaning a curiosity, open-hearted willingness, within the welcomes that are offered you. We don't have to go to every place. We don't have to be everything for everybody. Everything is very contextual and specific. So I have tended to enter into communities or practices in which I was invited, welcomed. Because again, I speak of it as the body of humanity. There is a sense of being a befriended outsider. I know who I am and whose I am, but I can visit and learn from those who will invite me into their community or into their practice. And they're more interested in me with a specific defined self. It's not the diffuse all differences so we find common ground to get along. It is be grounded in who you are and trust that the rough edges, the things that bump into one another, are there for a purpose for both parties to learn. So I invite you to this companionable way, considering it as a prayer, praying with, practicing the presence of God. And the dimensions of encounter, I've put the body first in this run through the course. Normally I would start with space and time, then I would do body, food, speech. So this run through the course, we're going to begin with the body, begin with prayer, and then move into dimensions of space and time. Those are going to go together to save time. Dimension of food, and then the dimension of speech, which is the one that Christians are the best at. It's the one that we think is the only dimension of encounter, because we're word people. We're, that's sort of how the charism we bring into the world communion is this love of the Bible, love of text, God as, and Jesus as the Word of God, the Logos tradition from Greek philosophy moving into Christian theology. So, we're a word people. So, of course, we would think speech is the only way that we would encounter people. That is actually not the case. There are all these other dimensions that are happening underneath our attention and our awareness. So that's why speech is last. When you get to speech, you're coming around the bend back to home. So this return to the body is not as easy or as simple as it sounds. There are a lot of things in our religious traditions, as we've been shaped in congregational life today. There are a lot of things in the world today that make us predisposed to despise the body, shame the body, refuse the body. And it's in our scripture, flesh bad, spirit good. Which when you actually get into the Greek in the text, soma, one of the words that Paul uses a fair amount to describe body created as good, body as vehicle of the Christ within, body as gift, good part of creation. We tend to just divide it and refuse it. And so it's like there's this whole world where spirit waits for us, and it's inside, but we are predisposed not only to project outward, but to refuse the body as suspicious, something to be controlled and confined, not something to be explored. And so the invitation that I offer is through Resma Menachem work. This is a fellow who, I forget when it was published, it was a good 10 years ago, I'd say. And he's I want to call him a marriage family counselor in Minnesota, but his work has really taken him into a particular kind of work in the world. But the thing so it's My Grandmother's Hands. And it's just the first 2 or 3 chapters of the book. I want to say a couple things about the context. Why I have it in this week. One is that he really is inviting us back into the body with a sense of practice, pause, patience, allowing, curiosity, trusting that there are somatic reactions, body somatic reactions, that the mind takes and runs with making stories of what the reactions are. And those reactions may be legitimate for the situation, but they actually may come from traumatic stories, either in our family, in our ancestral lineages. And so how do we befriend and become savvy to more of our body sensations? Week 3 was sort of the introduction to this, specific to fear. How do you recognize when your body is afraid? You might say, oh, just suck it up and, muscle through it. But when is your body afraid and why? This is sort of the next deepening step into that. And so, of course, the work has mostly been framed in a lot of what is called anti-racism work, and it can contribute to that conversation and has contributed to that conversation in some really significant ways. I'm more interested in relying on Menachem's wisdom to recognize that if you have a white body, there are particular streams of experience that are a part of your everyday reality. If you have a black or brown body, there are certain experiences that are germane and probable for your experience in your body. And then he uses the category blue. If you are a public service professional, you're going to have a mixture of those because of your professional responsibilities, your care of the community, or your policing or protection of the community. So, and so when when you go through the course of the book, excuse me, allergy season for me. It invites you to become aware of, and I'll just speak for myself, of having a white body and what that means that I won't experience. I mean, ever. And then for friends of mine who are in black or brown bodies, what is a daily experience for them that I have no access to because I have a white body? And so it's really behooved me to, over the last, I'd say 15 years, just to get curious and be willing to listen deeply to stories that need to be told and stories that need to be heard just in my local community. And my eyes have been opened to, and I can see and feel much more of what Resmaa Menakem would talk about as the inherited trauma responses that our bodies have, that are dependent not necessarily on our minds at all, but on how we present in the world, how we are seen in the world, and how the world then impacts us based on those pieces. And it's complicated because it's a deep wound in the history of the United States. And so one of the real gifts that Menachem's work brings in, and this is on page 1920. I invite you to, if you read nothing else of it. Oh, I think my dog is going to go crazy here, so apologize for that. Nala, you're all right. You're okay. She probably saw a squirrel. Clean pain and dirty pain is on pages 19 and 20. Clean pain is pain. So the first part that I really appreciate about it is that every life has pain. That's just a part of being human. There is a way to feel it, process it, receive it, let your body know that in your mind, create space for it, work through it. Sadness, grief, that's clean pain. Dirty pain is pain that is refused and either projected onto someone else or submerged. And it's going to come back. It's always going to come back. So Menachem's invitation is to learn how to steward clean pain, how to put yourself in situations, in healing settings where pain can be felt, received, processed, released healthily. And congregations are not the place to do that. They're too leaky. They're about different things. They're really good for other things, but they're not good for providing pathways of clean pain. Those tend to be spiritual direction, therapy, group spiritual direction, circle communities, writing groups, arts groups often, because you can express in that way. So anyway, Menachem's work really holds that we live in one world. We are all in the same world, and we experience the world infinitely differently. So it is each of our tasks to go within to identify what is the history of my body, my circumstance. What am I reactive to? What do I respond to with this charged energy that feels over the top for whatever the small slight was, or whatever the discomfort was. So that's what I've taken to looking for. I've done a lot of research now in ancestral lines, or you could just call those inherited patterns, depending on the language you're comfortable with. Trauma-informed learning, care, and healing. Some of that literature is really significant in what this course will be weaving in. And I always look for the signs in myself. When am I projecting some discomfort onto another? When I find myself using words like they do, or I would never, but they, I was like, okay, what's being projected? What am I refusing? What am I refusing to feel? And it's usually fear, sadness. There are all kinds of ways where when I feel my inclinations to fight or to flee, so fight or flight. Freeze, that's actually a big one for me, because I can sometimes be in a situation that feels threatening, but I also know that if I just stay still, it might pass and I'll get more knowledge. So sometimes I'll freeze. And then there's a fourth one that's often added on, which is called fawning. And I'm also careful with myself about that one. I have learned how to be safe in hierarchical, top-down organizations, often led by men or masculized women. Doesn't matter. It's the power over structure, not the gender. But I have learned how to be safe in those systems, which means I can often offer things that the one in power needs before he or she knows that they need it or want it, and that buys me entrance. That is a fawning behavior that I have. That's how I survived my family of origin. So when I catch myself in that pattern, it doesn't mean that that's not what I'm supposed to do. I mean, it could be that that's how I'm supposed to use my indirect power, but I have to be conscious of it. If I'm not conscious of it, then that is an avoidance strategy. It's always a mystery, motivation and agency and spirit. So anyway, I invite you into Manikam's work. That's one of the required readings. The other required reading already goes through some of what I did, the introduction to the spaces or dimensions of encounter from my book. So the third major focus then is the return to the body in prayer. This week, you have an opportunity to explore embodied prayer. There are links on Canvas that will invite you into the practice. The first one is simply about how music and prayer make community. And I want you to begin there, watch that video. I think it's about 4 minutes in length. It's not very long. But it will offer the gestures of prayer that I'm assigning for the week. The invitation is to pray 5 times a day. Muslims pray 5 times a day. For those who are most curious, I invite you into learning about Muslim prayer. What are the words? What are the body gestures? And when you see the video, there's one that's for kids, because in some sense we would be kids coming into that tradition. Very young, don't know anything, or know very little. And then there are some longer videos. There's a PDF that gives a huge overview, but that's in a print format if video is not your style. So those who are most curious, I invite you to explore that. What does it feel like to say those words? What does it feel like to learn those body movements? What does your body learn? What do you feel? What do you sense? What is your body reaction, sensate reaction? What does it touch? And it's always interesting to me because some students utter resistance. This is a Christian seminary course. You should never, ever do prayer in another tradition. I appreciate that sentiment. And I invite those who are in that sentiment to pray the Lord's Prayer 5 times a day with the body motions in that opening video, because they are actually from Syrian Christians. When we see Muslim prayer and the full prostrations and everything comes from somewhere. The Muslims didn't invite it or invent their prayer. They got it from Syrian Christians because Christianity and Judaism were the only traditions around when Islam was coming to form. And so Muslim prayer positions are actually from Christianity. So, but we don't need to dispute one God, and the Islamic God is different and than the Christian God. I don't get into debates and arguments about that. Um, what I'm interested in is getting you back into your body in prayer. And you can do that with these gestures from the ancient Syrian Christians and with the Lord's Prayer. Those who are most curious, who want to get the most out of the course, there are other pieces in place for you to explore and discern your capacity, discern your willingness to be in deep encounter with another person who prays like this. And the reason that I incorporated this into the course, for one, I think we inherit from our media culture and from movies serious misconceptions about Islam. And so each of us has an Islamophobia that is just poured into us every day in the media, particularly if you're on social media, particularly if you watch a lot of movies. You have a misconception about Islam. We all have misconceptions about Islam. And so praying as a Muslim would pray is an invitation grounded in prayer to encounter those misconceptions in your own body. Another thing, Allah, there are many Palestinian Christians who pray to Allah because Allah is simply God in Arabic. So, so if you ever encounter Palestinian Christians and they invite you to pray to Allah, they're Christian and they're praying to Allah. So how do you be with them? And how do you be in your own body with your own reactions to what that feels like to you? And how do you understand that to be? And the third thing I always like to say is that the word Muslim with a little m simply means one surrendered to God. I would argue that Jesus Christians surrendered to God are Muslim, small m, not capital M. Capital M means Islamic, but Muslim simply means surrendered to God. And that is what Jesus did. That's the pathway that Jesus opens for all of us in the power of his Spirit. So again, it just conflicts. It bumps into all of our preconceptions, and what we come in with can be a train wreck with some of these things from what we have been told, what we thought was absolutely true. And then we find, the world is a bit more mysterious than we realized. The invitation is to pray 5 times a day, at least 5 days in a row, if possible. You can, the way that I have often invited students to do this is to look at, pick an app, one that's easy to download and free. And there are apps, and there's a link on the Canvas page for it. Download the app, and it will send a reminder when it's time to pray in your geographical location, because the times change depending on where you are on Earth. And so the thing I love about it is the Muslim community prays at that time in that geographical location every day. And so you are praying with a whole community of people. You might be by yourself on the ground yourself in a room by yourself, but you are praying in community because it is organized by time. Now, I will say, if you keep your phone not on silent, be careful, because there was once I had my phone not on silent. I had the app on, and I just wasn't thinking, I wasn't aware of it. And it was connected to, I was holding space for a labyrinth for people to pray, walk the labyrinth. And so, of course, we had soft music on in the background, which was on my phone. And then it came to be prayer time in Kettering, Ohio, for the Islamic community. And from my phone came this, oh, yeah, whatever the call to prayer was. I had to go sprinting across the church fellowship hall to get my phone to turn off the music, because, it was the Islamic call to prayer, but that was not the soft music we were looking for the labyrinth. So if you do explore the app to invite you to prayer 5 times a day, just be aware of that. Keep your phone on silent, or just have it connect to your watch or something. But it's useful, for being reminded when to pray, and also to have a sense that you are praying with other people in your community right now, in your civic community. Muslims pray 5 times a day, at least. So that's a bit about the practice. A couple comments about the optional readings. They really are optional. They're state dependent, based on what feels of interest to you, what might help you, what might feed you best in the situations in which you find yourself. The first one, the 4 pivots, it's just the first section of the book, From Lens to Mirror. And I've included it for the first time this semester because it's an introduction to reflection and self-reflection. We live in organizational and familial systems that are predisposed against reflection. We're too busy, we're too afraid, or we're unwilling, we don't want to change, that we have loyalties to our own. And we've been taught and found from our own experience that holding those loyalties means that we'll be safer. And, it just goes on and on. As life accelerates in pace, more penalties are paid for slowing down, for taking time to sit with ideas or persons or challenges. And so many of us just aren't skilled in self-reflection. We know what we know and we go with it. We don't take any time to sit and listen and be receptive in stillness. Most of us don't know how to do that. I like to dare students, see if you can sit in silence for 5 minutes, just receiving, listening, watching your mind, watching your thoughts. Most of us, particularly clergy, that are, school, home, family, church, we can't sit for 5 minutes without feeling like we're wasting time. So that means we don't ever take time for self-reflection, and we forget how to do it. So that's not to guilt or blame anybody into it. This is the world we live in, but it does mean that we are predisposed against self-reflection, from recognizing the lens that we are seeing out of, and how do we turn that around? How do we let that become a mirror from time to time? And so there are reflections about how we use the word truth. And you can often hear that as what I call a straw man or woman for resistance. Listen to my truth, say many who need to be heard. That's identity politics. There are lots of things, voices for those who haven't felt heard or seen. And so they grab onto an identity and put it forward. And then there are those who say there's only one truth, and there's a refusal to listen to anything else. Of course, humility requires that we hold these either or things in tension. God wants us to draw close to one another in God, which means vulnerability, new stories that we didn't know, experiences we couldn't imagine from our experience, often perceived as directly challenging our own, but they need not challenge our own. So the image that I sometimes invite is you can hold an apple in one hand, you can hold an orange in the other hand, and they can coexist in you as you sit with them. You don't have to try to smash them together. In you, they can rest in tension, yes, but just hold them in tension and see what happens. So then the final section is clarity. And this is really one of the phrases that I like. It doesn't matter what you look at, it matters what you see. That's Henry David Thoreau, who's a North American philosopher. And this is just simply the previous reflections on knowledge being state dependent. State dependent knowing means that what you see comes partially from what you already know, how you're feeling, what you hope for, alongside what is there. We like to think that what we see is only what is there. But when you allow some space, some time, some curiosity, you might see that there is more there than you saw originally. So that's the 4 pivots, again, optional. And then the second choice is from a book of Prentice Hemphill, What It Takes to Heal, How Transforming Ourselves Can Change the World. The section is simply feeling and the body. And so I ask, do you need to relearn how to cry? When was the last time you had a really big cry? Think about it. I don't know, maybe it was recent for you. For many of us, can't even remember the last time you had a big cry, particularly masculine gender or masculinized, because, men pretty much get the crap knocked out of them if they show emotion. So what, there's So I like to ask, on an imagined scale of 1 to 10, how emotionally expressive of a person are you? Now, my ancestral lineage, Pennsylvania Deutsch, German American, I'd give myself a 3 or a 4. I learned early on being a deep feeling person was not going to protect me and my family. So I don't express emotions. We supposedly got a dog because Lisa wouldn't express emotions. This is like before I was 3 or 4, when they made that decision. I'm learning to move in the direction of 5 to 6. I'm learning to catch and know more fully what my body is feeling and hold and get curious about what the sensation might mean, what the feeling might bring. So feeling in body, what does it mean to relearn body cues? And then how in alignment are our values with our embodiment of those values? An easy one. We say we value good health. Statistics of chronic illness and lifestyle today point to a vastly different embodiment than that value. Now, our systems don't help us. Industrialized food, most processed food is horrible for human consumption, which leads to chronic illness, obesity, type 2 diabetes, on and on. And so the food that is most readily available is the food that's worst for you. And yet, we want to be healthy, and then we wonder why we're not. So there's so many systems that are predisposed against us finding good health, or bring it closer to home. We value Jesus's mission to the poor, the oppressed, and the sick. But many congregations understand their central purpose and location is worship on Sunday mornings. And this other stuff is adiaphora, it's mission. It is out there. It's, what some of us will do, but it's not the center of our communal life. The center of our communal life has become Sunday morning worship or running the committee service, committee work, which are all really faithful vocations. It's not an either or, but it is interesting to, of course, take Jesus at his word and then look at what congregational Christianity is and has become, and to get curious about so many disparities. Like, what is that? Wow, and I trust the divine order of things. It's clearly what it was supposed to be for today. And it's interesting to see how far apart some of the mission of Jesus is with some of what American Christianity is today, which I think is why I'm still here as a seminary professor. I'm supposed to ask that question. So I asked the question. So what if we were to explore our own sensate lives with curiosity and welcome of what would come? Not what we've been told we're supposed to feel or what we're not supposed to feel and then feel shamed or ashamed about it, but no, to actually create spaces for reflection, practice pause, to sense what actually comes forward, welcoming whatever comes forward is what needs to be heard. That is a very different prayer approach than I inherited from Protestant Christian formation. And then the third one, if I optional reading, I need to get it photocopied and up onto the shell, but is Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited. He's got a chapter on deception. It doesn't quite fit, but you can make an argument that we do deceive ourselves about our feelings all the time. So, but it fits within the flow of that book, and I just wanted you to have access to it. I think it's an invitation for us to feel more deeply, be confronted with things that might scare us or challenge us, seek to change us. He talks about deception as the oldest of all the techniques by which the weak have protected themselves against the strong. And I smiled as I typed it into my notes because I think there's so many ways that we self-protect against God all the time. I think the intimacy is so deep and is so overwhelming, is so abundant. And, when you've grown up in an environment of scarcity or fear, poverty, abandonment, neglect, intimacy can be threatening. So there's another favorite writer of mine, David Schnarr. She talks about intimacy is not for the faint of heart. It is being known, warts and all, and loved anyway. And you don't earn it. You don't learn more to get it. You don't achieve it. Yet there is an activity or an agency necessary to deeply receive. So it brings us back to love and knowledge. How do they relate in your life? How do they dance for you? Do you love first and then come to know more fully? Or do you seek to know first so you can love more deeply? So I invite you to dance with those. Thanks for your attention, for your investment in God's call in your life. And I look forward to steeping with what arises, as always.